Hello, hello, hello. This is Chris Ferdinandi from GoMakeThings.com. Thank you so much for joining me today. In my last video, I talked about using the Shadow DOM and the Light DOM together in a web component. And I got a really great question from Fabrizio Espinoza Mora, who wrote, how do you deal with layout shift with web components? I'm developing a text input custom element, but when the page refreshes, there's no space to occupy the element until milliseconds later when it renders, and the height of the element is not predictable before it loads. This is a really great question. This comes up a lot with web components, that flash of either unstyled content or invisible content. And I thought that would be an interesting one to dig into today. So for this one, I am going to use a component I have as part of the toolkit over at the Lean Web Club. So just real quick, if you're not familiar with it, the Lean Web Club is my course, code, and community platform for folks who want to learn how to build better for the front end. You can get a month free if you sign up today, but also this week, I'm running a special Black Friday, Cyber Monday kind of deal. So you'll actually get 50% off of your membership for an entire year. And that expires next week. So feel free to take advantage of that now if you want the best deal you can get on my best offering for teaching you web development. So anyways, that's over at leanwebclub.com. I'll drop a link down in the description. In the Lean Web Club, under Toolkit, I've got a collection of web components. These are ones that I actually use on client projects and things like that. And one of them is my toggle password component, which is used to turn a normal password input into something where you can toggle the visibility of the password on and off. If we jump over here, you can see some examples of that in action. It can either be a checkbox or a button. And it can also include having the password visible by default and the ability to have the text inside that button change whether the password is visible or not. It could also be like an icon or something like that if you wanted. And so we're going to use this as our demo today to talk about some different approaches that we might use. So the first easiest solution to this is to take a progressive enhancement approach to building your web component. I just noticed this text is a little small. Let me make it bigger and hope that Sublime behaves itself. All right, cool. There we go. So let's take a look at how this one works. So this is the way I personally like to author my web components. I've got my custom element, toggle password, and then rather than letting the web component render the content, I have it here already as HTML. So I've got my label, I've got my input, I've even got the element that's going to control the password visibility. It could be a checkbox, it could be a button, and then I have some attributes I'm using to control different things. So the visible attribute defines whether the password should be visible by default or hidden. I'm using the toggle attribute to flag the thing that triggers password visibility on or off. So the input or the button respectively. Those are really the big ones. I've also got this is hidden and invisible, is visible attributes, but I'm using those just as selectors in my CSS. They don't actually do anything within the script. And then inside the web component script, I am grabbing those elements. I'm grabbing the password fields. I'm grabbing the toggle element, the trigger, and I'm checking to see if it's a button or an input so we can handle that behavior just a little bit differently. And then I'm checking to see if the password should be visible by default. And then when the script loads, I am going to unhide that toggle. So one of the things you may have noticed is I have it hidden by default. And then when the script loads, I unhide it so that you can see it. If the toggle or the trigger is a button, I'm setting an ARIA pressed attribute with an initial value of true if the password should be visible by default or false if it should be hidden. And then I'm also setting a type attribute of button so that if this button is inside a form element, it will not act like a submit and it won't cause the form to submit and try to send to a server. And then if the password should be visible, I'm showing my fields, and I'm setting up my event listener so that when our trigger is clicked, we either show or hide the password respectively. And then I've got a couple of, sorry, where are they? A couple of methods for doing that. So we're going to loop through and change the type on the password fields. And then we're going to update the ARIA pressed attribute on that button to either true or false. This lets screen readers know what the current state of that button is, so that someone who's visually impaired and operating with a keyboard and a screen reader understands what's happening in the UI that they're working with. So that's kind of the high level. And the nice thing about this approach, you'll see if I jump over here, I have network throttling on. I have this set to like a really slow 3G network. And if I reload the page, you'll notice that my controls aren't visible. This one actually is not hidden and it should be. So let's fix that. Oh no, it is hidden. Why is it showing up? It's probably got something to do with this. Either that or I don't have hidden defined, or there's a typo somewhere. But that's all right. Besides the point, what I'm trying to show is you'll notice that the controls are gone and then they show up, but all of the main controls are actually here and they're working the way you would expect them to. There's another way that I typically see web components approached, and we can talk about that too. But just to kind of summarize this section here, I think one of the easiest, best ways to handle this issue is to hard code as much of the functional HTML into the UI by default as possible. So if I had some sort of input web component that was validating a field or doing a quick lookup when users type, like maybe it's a password field, but you want to validate that the password field is valid and meets certain credentials, or that it's not on some list of common passwords that you don't want to let users use. I would wrap a functional password input in that web component and bolt in the extra interactivity once the web component loads, but I would still have some working functional HTML in the UI to start. And that's going to do a long way in avoiding some of the jank. You'll still get a little bit of layout shift as those other controls load, but not nearly as much. It's a much more resilient approach to web development. Now, that's not always a possibility. You will sometimes have situations where the web component needs to render all of the HTML for you. I have a modified example of this web component that does exactly that. Just if you want to download these and play with them yourself, I'll make sure I include a link to the source code down in the description. So here I have my toggle password components, but they're empty. There's nothing inside them. And then I have some attributes I can use to control certain things. A default field value, a use button attribute that says this should be a button instead of a checkbox. The visible attribute is here again. And if we jump over to the JavaScript, you can see I'm checking for various attributes and then setting some properties based on them. I've even added the ability, I'm not using it in this example, but I've added the ability to control the label on the field name itself, the value of the field, which we are using, whether it should be a button or not, whether the thing that triggers it should have a different label beyond show password. Maybe you want to call it something different. And so we're doing all that. And then inside our init, rather than just checking for the existing state of the DOM and changing some things, I am rendering the entire UI based on those properties and those attributes that are defined in the HTML. So you start with an empty element and then you render stuff into it. Now, I don't love this approach. There are times where it's a thing you need to do. And you'll see where this becomes problematic. So I've got the backgrounds here highlighted so they're more easy to see. I am again throttling down to 3G. And if I reload the page, it's going to take a second, but you can see you get nothing and they're really short. And then once the content loads, it gets big. And so that is a much more jarring kind of experience. Sometimes you can get away with it. So depending on what the web component does, you might have some different content in there. So for example, an example I use all the time is like, let's say you had an element that was supposed to, or web component that was going to make an API call to GitHub to grab a list of your top 5 repositories on GitHub and display them as some sort of list in the UI, just based on the number of stars, right? It's going to show the most popular ones. So some sort of GitHub stars is the name of it. So rather than having nothing here, you could start off with like a link to your, let's say github.com/user/cferdinandi, right? So view my projects on GitHub. So you can have something like this. And then when the web component loads, it replaces this with the actual content. It makes the fetch call, replaces it. And you're still going to get a jump. You're still going to get a layout shift, but there's usable content, even if it's not anything like what the finished product is going to look. So that's one approach. Sometimes like that layout jump isn't a huge deal, but with something like a form, it can be really weird. Like this is a really big one. So one technique that I absolutely love for stuff like this is web components actually provide a way for you to detect when they're loaded without you having to use JavaScript at all. You can do it entirely with CSS. So there's no need for an onload event. There's no need for your web component to add a custom class or attribute to itself once it's loaded. And the way you do that is with the defined pseudo class. So when an element is defined, so this doesn't mean that it's completed all its tasks, but it means that this custom elements define method has finished running and instantiated this class. Once it's done that, the defined attribute applies to, the defined pseudo class applies to the element you are attaching it to in your CSS. You can pair it with the not pseudo class to run some code when your custom element has not yet been defined. And then once it has been, that class no longer applies, or that CSS no longer applies. So here, I did a little check once these elements loaded and realized they're around 85 pixels high, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, but that gets us in a ballpark. So, understanding, of course, that Fabrizio specifically said that the element height is not always predictable. So you're going to make a guess. You're going to like shoot for an average here. It's not going to be perfect, but you can say that when this element is not defined, give it a minimum height of something. In this case, let's say 85 pixels. And then once that element is defined, the minimum height goes away and the natural height of the content in there replaces it. So let me reload this page now that I've uncommented that CSS. And you can see how it works in action. So I've got these boxes, and then the content shows up and fills them. So there's at least space being occupied by where the elements will go. And you might even do something where this background color is only there when the elements are loading. You might have some sort of that flickering placeholder text. So just as an example here, somewhere in here, I have some CSS to do that. Let's see if I can find that. What is it? It's like a skeleton, I think it's called. Add placeholder content. Yeah, so something like this, right? So you can do that with keyframes. So you might, for example, add this to your content. I'm just going to see what this looks like because I'm kind of curious. So let's go ahead and comment that out. And we will do this. So we'll strip that out. We'll pop that in here. And if we jump over and reload, yeah, so you can see they pulse while loading, and then once the content loads, they go away. So that gets you kind of that skeleton effect as well. So that might be a worthwhile strategy to look into. None of these are perfect. There's always trade-offs. For my money, I'd recommend going with hard coding as much HTML as you can and then just progressively enhancing the rest. But your mileage may vary. So anyways, that's it for today's video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, comment, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. YouTube loves it, helps the channel grow. I feel like such a shill saying that. I'm so sorry. It's just, you got to do it. And also don't forget that if you want to dig into more web components like this and really kind of dive into how web components work, I have a bunch of lessons on web components inside the Lean Web Club. I've also got a bunch of actual web components I use on my own projects that you can dig into and deconstruct and play around with. And this week into next week, you can get 50% off your membership for an entire year after a 30-day free trial if you sign up today. So don't miss out on that. Head over to the Lean Web Club, check it out, and I will see you next time. Cheers.